Aran actually started his career in mathematics as an undergrad at Stanford, and has fallen ever since to the darkness of deep neural network. Doing first a PhD with Dan Yamins, he's gotten all the wrong ideas about what it means to understand the brain. Spew nonsense like objective and like algorithm and stuff. But yeah, so sorry, I hope you guys see that. It's not an insult, okay? I hope it's clear to people. And with Sri Ganguly, and then he came here, be an icon postdoc fellow working with Mardad Jazieri and me, where he has been educating us about how to do it right. It's the brain, putting everything together, from vision, motor control. So he's going to tell us some of the first steps going in this direction, which I'm also very excited to hear more about. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. And also thanks especially to Hector, Chris, and Jim for inviting me and organizing this. So today I'm going to give 2 case studies in both rodents and primates where it's been helpful and useful to take an approach of generating visual representations in a self-supervised way that ends up being both useful for high-dimensional embodied control as well as increased gains in neural predictivity. And some of the motivation from this comes from I guess really everyone in this room has seen the brain score plot where you plot neural predictivity, in this case to macaque V4 and IT over ImageNet top 1 performance. And one thing we see is that we've kind of hit a sort of cap on our ability to predict neurons, and in particular across very high performant models with varying depths. We see quite similar neural predictivities in both V4 and IT. And furthermore, recent work led by Colin Conwell and Talia Kunkel's group comparing high-performing CNNs and vision transformers to one another to human occipitotemporal cortical responses in the 17 natural scenes data set, and carefully fixing the input diet and task, but varying the architecture, see very similar regressed neural predictivities to these response patterns, to these voxel response patterns. And this is particularly striking given that, at least prima facie, these 2 kind of inductive biases look very different, though, I mean, of course, what's happening here is that they're still converging up to the metrics that we're measuring similarity on quite similar representations. But nonetheless, the thing that is motivating for the work I'll kind of show you today is that we're still tapping out on predictive models of visual cortex in both humans and primates, and suggests that new ideas are needed even though we're exploring very different architectures. And so part of the motivation for this is to kind of take a step back and consider what type of inputs we train our neural networks on. So on this set of images are example ImageNet images, and typically they involve an object that's kind of in the center of the scene with great lighting, and someone took a picture with a camera phone across a variety of scenarios. And as both humans and animals, I think the main point, just at least cognitively, we do a lot more than passively fixating and looking at images that are centrally located. And in particular, for example, like in scenes like this, egocentric views, whereby there's lots of changes in lighting and pose and viewing conditions, we not only can rapidly recognize these objects, but we can also infer relationships between objects, that the cars are on the road, people are lining the sidewalk, and the buildings are supported by the ground. And even in quote unquote simpler animals, for example, a crow can perform these kind of more complex multi-step plans. So in this case, the crow is using a stick to get this object out that it couldn't otherwise reach with its beak. Furthermore, animals can use their bodies to navigate effortlessly across a variety of environments. And what's being shown here as the mouse is navigating are the activations of its place cells in its hippocampus as it does so. And finally, animals can masterfully and skillfully interact with their environments, rivaling any robot that we have today. So for me, the motivation here is like, what are the core design principles that give rise to these abilities? And in particular, more specifically, how can we go about bridging the gap from neurons to behavior? And so in what I'll show you today, I'll focus on visual scene understanding to an extent, especially in scenes where there's multiple objects, so it's kind of hard to really ascribe a single category label, and show that there's a connection between self-supervised learning, so that's where it's otherwise hard to assign this sort of external label, and being able to flexibly control a high-dimensional animal body. And so I'm going to focus on two papers, and one is in mice, and the other is in primates. And in particular, I'm just going to use the mouse as a setup. So I don't necessarily intend to spend too much time, but I think it does highlight some interesting questions there that then lead to the second case study of primate mental simulation. And then given that this is a nice group and we can have discussions, I thought I'd end with some purposefully informal heuristics of sort of going about maybe asking questions about natural intelligence towards the end, very briefly. Now, just before I kind of dive into it, let me just kind of give the abstract skeleton of the approach, because I guess what I'm going to show you tends to be bar plots with lots of bars and lots of models. And I kind of want to give a sense of purpose as to why we do it this way. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with it and others are less so. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, the basic roadmap with all of these is going to be the following. Is to, one, specify and operationalize a behavioral domain of interest, particularly, I guess, this is CMM, and like in general, we're at MIT, so we're interested in kind of figuring out the ways that brains have surpassed current engineering systems. In the past, a lot of focus has been on core object recognition, and I think I'm just going to show you that perhaps having a slightly broadened focus, but related one to flexible embodiment could be useful. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to hypothesize architectures and tasks, and these kind of come about in these three components. And really the main idea here is not to have straw man hypotheses and not to have any favored hypotheses, but really just functionally reasonable ones. And really have the data ultimately tell us what are the solutions that best match neural response patterns. And the question of naturally arises is, well, where do we get these hypotheses from? And I guess kind of as a theme, we get some of our constraints from neuroanatomical observations with regards to the architecture class loosely, as well as from ethology for characterizing the types of environments and data streams we train our networks on. And then we get inspiration from cognitive science to formulate tasks and objective functions. And then what we're going to do is take these three components optimized for the task through the given architecture on this data stream. And I guess the thing I want to emphasize a bit is that every time we do this, this is a type of evolution that we're performing, but in silico. And it's not meant to recapitulate every detail of mammalian evolution, but it's just to get a sense of like, when I put this into a computer and I put these pressures in these three knobs of architecture, task, and data stream, what do I get out? And importantly, what we're going to then do is take that representation. Crucially, we don't train necessarily on the same task that the animal is doing, because generally that's slightly impoverished, but we're just trying to gain a normative understanding by then predicting held out neural and behavioral data. And ideally, the situation that we're in is that by doing this, the empirics of the neural and behavioral data demarcate only a small range of hypotheses which best match it, and we can start to see trends across these. So it's good to always, notice the highest, say, neurally predictive model, but we're also interested in trends across models of what classes of architectures and loss functions and data streams best predict high throughput neural and behavioral responses. And then the point is that after we've done this procedure, we can generate core conceptual insights about the system under study by then identifying patterns of the best architectures and tasks. And what this gives us is a structural through the architecture and functional through the task loss and the data stream, normative understanding of the evolutionary pressures of the biological system in order to produce the behavior that we're going to operationalize. So that's going to be the roadmap that I'm going to take for the next 2 case studies. And I'll give you I'll flesh out this outline as we go. So we first started with mouse visual cortex, not because we were interested or that we thought that there was anything necessarily any more special about mouse visual processing than primate visual processing, but at least for me, was a way to start to interface with an animal that is commonly used in systems neuroscience, and first gain an insight of like the level 0 sensory domain before then, say, operationalizing that in other downstream brain areas that then operate off of that. So in particular, this work is actually going to involve really tuning each of these knobs to get a good model of mouse visual cortex, and was co-led with Nathan Kong when I was at Stanford, and is going to be published in PLOS Comp Bio soon. So from the outset, it's the deep hierarchy of the primate ventral stream is quite obvious, and when we look at hierarchical CNNs where we can physically map layers in a CNN to distinct visual areas in the ventral visual pathway, we see a nice and tight correspondence there. But kind of just purely looking at anatomical differences, if we look at mouse visual cortex, we don't really see much of a physical hierarchy. In fact, what you see is usually V1 in the center is the largest area, and then a bunch of kind of downstream parallel pathway higher visual areas that go around it. And just to gain a little bit of insight as to whether this is functionally relevant, if you look at basically the split half reliability of responses in mouse visual cortex over time, what you see is that there's roughly, in terms of when the responses come on, 3 to 4 groups as such. And this is just a very coarse approximation. Lots of other folks have done more detailed studies on the shallow hierarchy in mouse visual cortex. But the question is whether or not these differences that we're seeing on the outset meter out into real functional differences. And the only way we can do that is really by building a model and comparing it to responses. And so just to highlight kind of what the conundrum was when we first started doing this type of modeling, when sort of the first Allen Institute data sets came out, recording from mouse visual areas, a common thing was to just take, say, a very deep CNN off the shelf. It was already pre-trained, someone else did that, and apply it and ask, well, how well did it predict responses? And one thing you see in general, and I'll show this on newer metrics, but there was first very low predictivity between model layers and mouse visual areas, and 2, it was just awkward. Like you'd get mid-level areas that could best predict an otherwise functionally shallow area. And so the conundrum I guess we want to look at is, well, are there actually core differences between mouse visual processing and the processing that we're used to in the primate ventral stream? And I'll just kind of give you the answer up front in terms of formulating this language. One is that actually, it involves changing the circuit class to a shallow architecture rather than a deep one, operating at a lower visual acuity, and not using any types of specialized objectives, but more domain general self-supervised objectives. And so if we take that VGG16 model I just showed you in the previous slide and call that our baseline of sorts, just for historical reasons, that was the first model that was used, what the main result is when you get all those three factors right, is a sort of shallow, low resolution self-supervised model improves neural predictivity from this sort of deeper, high resolution, more category supervised primate model to about 90% of the animal to animal consistency. And so now what I'm going to just do is kind of break down the three factors. So first, the architecture class. We started with just the standards, AlexNet, VG16, and then resonance of varying depth. Resonance are a great way to kind of control for things like depth because of the repeated blocks. But again, like we should think back to the model system that we're studying is mouse, and there's actually a lot that's known about its connectome. So there was some work around the time when we started taking the connectivity that was somewhat known, but also adding in details of, say, repeated linear, nonlinear transforms across layer 4, 2, 3, and 5, and having those operate on each layer. But the reason why I'm mentioning it is that one thing that this model wasn't trained or compared to data when we started, but when we ended up kind of comparing this model to neural responses, optimizing it both first for object categorization, you get these green bars here. So it improves somewhat, but it's still not the best match to neural responses overall. And in particular, ends up ultimately assuming too many biological details to best match these neural responses. In particular, for example, it's a little too deep, as our later analyses showed. But even if you switch the loss function completely, we tried our own slight variations of this architecture too, so that's why you see two bars. But even when you switch it to a self-supervised objective, while that improves things, it's still not the best model overall. And so we tried building our own kind of shallower versions of these network architectures. The details here don't matter too much because they're still not the best model, but they do improve things a bit, both when they're untrained over the previous mouse net, and then once they're trained, you get further improvements, and then likewise, when you train them with a self-supervised objective, you get even greater improvements. But the thing I want to point out is that despite our best efforts and those of others, I really did view this as a heroic effort on the part of the authors originally, is that ultimately this sort of more feed-forward, but say the first 4 layers of an AlexNet are ultimately still the best. And I don't necessarily want to mince too many differences between these two, but I guess it was sort of a lesson of, which I'll get to at the end, of a balance between finding the right functional optimization goal and also the right kind of macro scale architecture. And in particular, what I mean by macro scale is that if you look across all architectures and look at neural predictivity versus model depth, you see that actually models about with up to 10 linear nonlinear layers tend to suffice for matching mouse visual cortex. And you see that the mouse nets kind of start to fall outside of this boundary. And this is actually very much already, as a macro scale constraint, is already very much unlike in primates, where Jonas and Martin and others in Jim's lab in BrainScore, if you also do this kind of model depth versus neural predictivity, you at least see some trend towards and preference towards building deeper models, unlike what we see here in mouse. Now, I mentioned architecture. I'll just briefly mention resolution as another factor. And it just comes from the observation that rodents typically operate at most about 0.5 cycles per degree in visual acuity. Primates are a lot higher at 30 cycles per degree. And you can convert this into pixels. And we just did this by downsampling. There's lots of better ways to do this, but we just wanted to coarsely get at this constraint. And so if you look at neural predictivity across each of the mouse visual areas, across 2 of our best architectures that are self-supervised, and then vary on the x-axis the image resolution, what you see is that the neural predictivity across visual areas tends to peak around the pixel converted mouse visual field. And this is when you retrain, you have to re-optimize the network with these downsampled images to get this. So there's that constraint. And then finally, I'll focus on the last one, which I think is the most interesting one, and then we'll get into the connection to embodied control, which is a preference towards a more domain general self-supervised loss. So we first started with standard losses, ImageNet, and we're aware, this is more of a control, if anything, but also good to just see how far it gets us. It's quite unnatural in some sense ethologically for mice, both in type and number of categories, but there is a lot of diversity in the image statistics, so that might be useful. We also looked at variations of, say, less supervision as another control with CFAR 10, so 10 object classes instead of 1,000 and less images. Another one was kind of more specialized a little bit to the domain of rodents, which is basically depth map prediction. And you could imagine the whiskers of the rodent getting this information by brushing against 3D objects. And so we took the largest data set we could find at the time to train on this. In addition to those more specialized objectives, we considered a variety of self-supervised losses. These include kind of your standard sparse autoencoding. Around the time we started, this was like a couple years prior, there was the idea of predicting image rotation. So predict whether an image is at 0, 90, or 180, or 270 degrees. That seemed to give some powerful representations that were useful for downstream tasks. But around the time we started, it had just very recently, this kind of class of contrastive objectives came on the scene, where the basic idea is to basically, for a single image, to contrast multiple views of the same object, push those representations together, and push them apart as negative samples from images of different objects. And that's the basic idea. And so this is going to be the main set of self-supervised objectives that is going to be useful. And when we fix the best architecture, so in this case AlexNet, and image resolution, and just vary the loss function, what we see is overall that using a self-supervised contrastive objective improves this type of neural predictivity across areas, and differentially so. But the reason why I want to highlight this is that, and I was involved in some of this work that Chengshu Zhuang led, which was that in primates, actually taking these more contrastive objectives didn't really improve the match overall to primate V1, V4, and IT, in particular, really matched the neural predictivity. So there still seems to be some, and if you have a semi-supervised loss that is a bit better from the standpoint of behavior in addition to neurons. So it seems to be, at least in this system of rodents, contrastive is actually giving you better neural predictivity than the standard supervised losses. So we wanted to ask, well, why, and not only that, but they're also better than, say, the other self-supervised objectives that came before it of autoencoding and rotation and predicting neurons, and also outperforms this sort of more whisking proxy loss, which, I guess highlights maybe usefulness of kind of developing objective functions for sensory systems that are more domain general than specialized necessarily in this manner. But ultimately, the big question left on the table is what might be the ecological reason for the neurons to prefer self-supervision. And so the first thing we did was, again, go back and look at neural predictivity as a function of, in this case, ImageNet add the resolution of visual acuity fixed for the rodent and categorization activity. And overall, what we see is that you have to be a reasonable self-supervised representation learner, but ultimately your performance on ImageNet is quite poor. And generally, as you get to better and better models, there is a significant drop in neural predictivity. And again, this is very different from the goals in primates, where actually there is, at least for the most part, a reasonable trend line of getting good at categorization accuracy and matching neurons. So the hypothesis that we had was that perhaps what's going on is that mouse visual cortex is kind of using its limited resources of a shallower cortex and operating at lower visual acuity to learn as task general of a representation as possible. So to assess this, we took our networks and we evaluated them on a variety of downstream tasks that they weren't ever trained on explicitly. So in particular, you pre-train on ImageNet and then evaluate on a reward-based navigation task, which I'll explain in a minute. But then also you can pre-train on this navigation, on this maze environment itself from egocentric views that a virtual rodent is navigating in, and also assess downstream visual scene understanding in addition to ImageNet as well. So specifically what I mean by this is we're going to take our vision networks, take our best ones that are self-supervised, and also take the supervised control with the same architecture and data stream, and basically drop it into this biomechanically realistic rodent body that was developed a year prior to our study by Josh Morrell and others in Bensei Elvexi's lab. And what we're going to do is we're going to we're going to fix the weights of this network. It's pre-trained on ImageNet, drop it into this new maze environment, and then have it train a policy to operate the actuators of this rodent body. And in particular, this task is somewhat constraining, despite I would still argue that the scene is itself not as complex as obviously what a rodent sees, but it requires keeping track of history over long timescales with high dimensional relative to what's currently achievable in RL, and involves basically you get reward as you navigate from a random location in the maze to getting this ball. And what we see is that actually when we drop our contrastively optimized shallow architectures, we get higher mean episode return on this task than its supervised alternative. Again, the vision network itself is trained on ImageNet and then evaluated on this task in a new maze environment. And then moreover, if we then test generalization the other way, where we train on the maze environment and then test on a variety of visual scene understanding tasks, and either train on these images with the same exact architecture and data stream, either contrastively or in a supervised way, where supervision in this case, in this maze environment, are is the RL objective now. We can transfer to these pose, position, size, categorization tasks better comparatively, and moreover also to texture recognition on the texture classification data set. And so one question we wanted to ask is, do the contrastive methods that generalize the best also match the neurons better? Is there a correspondence between increased neural predictivity and the contrastive methods that obtain this task general representation? So if we look at, again, best architecture and data stream fixed, but then vary the objective function and the training data, what we see is that the contrastive loss for the best architecture is better than both the supervised or the RL loss in the same environment. And as shown here, when you fix the environment but change the loss function and keep the architecture fixed. And furthermore, there's a second point to be made, that a diverse training environment better matches neurons across loss functions. So meaning, if you fix the loss function, but then go from ImageNet to this kind of more impoverished maze environment, you see an improvement in neural predictivity across these loss functions. So it suggests both this, to get this task general representation, both having this self-supervised representation and a high variation training diet. So going back to our original kind of question, what might be the core differences between mouse visual cortex and the primate ventral stream? We saw that the circuit was more preferentially shallow, operating at lower visual acuity, and subject to those two constraints was trying to learn a task general representation via this contrastive self-supervised loss. And it seems to suggest that, at least for the purposes of what we've seen on this data, that mouse visual cortex is trying to utilize these limited resources to perform a variety of downstream visual tasks, and in particular lends itself to better embodied control of this virtual rodent body. And this is very much in contrast to the deeper, more high resolution and more categorization dominated ventral stream that we saw earlier. So the next case study in the remaining time that I'll focus a bit more time on is recent work going a little bit outside of vision to and to do a change of species in primate to higher cognitive areas. And in particular, this was work done in collaboration with Rishi Rajalingam, who collected the neural data, which I'll explain, Murdad Jazieri and Robert Yang. And it primarily involves, the architectures aren't going to change all that much. They're going to be kind of your run-of-the-mill deep CNNs, vision transformers, but we're going to keep the task, we're going to vary the task loss and the ecological diet to get a better understanding of this system. In particular, the kind of motivating question here is that across a variety of environments, you and I and also animals infer a lot more than just the pixels that are encoded in the scene. So in particular, on the top left, I took this picture at a Shinto shrine in Japan, and I guess you can, these ice blocks are there to, you take a piece of paper and then you put your, it against the ice block, and then it reveals your fortune. But I can't, I'm not that sophisticated. So all I can infer at least is that this ice block on the right has been out longer than the one on the left. And for example, I can also predict, are these two stacks stable of cups, being porcelain on the right and of different material properties of, say, paper on the left. My cat will predict before she jumps on the box whether this box will support her. In addition to inferring and predicting, you know, every day that I go out, I plan, you know, say, how might I take these hats off the rack? And I have a motor program that I use to do that before I do it. And so the idea is that, well, the hypothesis at least is that in order to enable all of these behaviors, we're doing some simulation of the future state of our environment. And so the earliest code I could find was this of Kenneth Craik. And in particular, the basic idea is, it goes back to at least 1943 where it was written, and this is the actual text itself. The brain builds mental models of the physical world that support physical inferences via these mental simulations. And in particular, the type of calculation he had in mind was actually a computation, which was kind of surprising to me when I saw it, because at the time, if I recall, the computers would have been analog. So this actually predates the digital computer. But what he had in mind was a type of computation. And it wasn't until the past decade or so that we started seeing behavioral evidence, most notably out of Josh Tenenbaum's group, whereby having a type of intuitive physics engine can best match human physical judgments on blocks of towers, as well as work from Nancy Kanwisher's group of physics engine from human neuroimaging evidence, specifically involving a network of brain regions in the frontal parietal areas that are recruited by these physical inferences that also contains information about mass and physical stability. And then about a year, both a year or two ago, there were two papers that Rishi had with Mehrdad, where they focused on one node in the frontal parietal network known as DMFC, so dorsal medial frontal cortex. And what they did was they trained macaques to operate a joystick and play this ball interception task. So it's just like the game of Pong. The ball has to hit the paddle. But then the catch is that basically right as the ball approaches the paddle, it's occluded from view. And what they showed was that by comparing RNNs that do this sort of intermediate simulation of the ball state versus endpoint prediction, that there was evidence of this type of simulation going on in the underlying neural dynamics of DMFC. So the crux question, I guess, for us is what might be the neural mechanisms that enable us to predict the future state of our environment across diverse settings. So not just Pong, but really, as you can see, this is done really across a variety of environments that we have evidence for. So like with any question, we want to carve out a hypothesis space. In particular, what I'm going to carve out is a few set of constraints of what hypotheses we're looking at here. One is that these models are input-driven, so they take in unstructured visual inputs across a range of physical phenomenon. And this is particularly important since, at least in this domain, there's a lot of models that say don't do that, and we're really interested in how to do this really from raw sensory inputs, and that enables us to ask us questions of generalization and try it out in a variety of environments. And now in doing so, they can also, these models generate outputs, so they generate physical predictions for each scenario that we can then compare to behavioral patterns as well. And most crucially, that they consist of internal units that we can then compare to biological units in the process of both being input-driven and generating physical predictions. So they have to contain some neural correlates. So as a result, just going back to this picture, they're going to involve an instantiation of an architecture class, a loss function that we optimize over on an environment. And just to give these things a name, not to signify that they're novel or anything, but just to give it a name, we'll call them sensory cognitive networks. And they'll have a sensory component that operates on pixels, it's a visual encoder, and then a stand-in for the frontal cortices that does this future prediction in a variety of ways. So the overall approach is that we're going to first start by building our hypotheses by training them on data. In particular, I think a lot of people in this room especially have seen this, which is in 3D world, where there's 8 different scenarios that focus on everyday physical understanding involving lots of solid object contact, but also soft body to hard body interactions, and this drape scenario on the bottom right. And in addition to training on this virtual environment where there's a lot of control over the types of scenes, we'll also train on a much larger naturalistic video data set known as Kinetic 700. It has a bit of a focus on human actions and is another control for getting variety in our data streams. Once we have these pre-training data, the variety of hypotheses fall under 3 broad classes, within which will vary the architecture. The first one is this sort of end-to-end future prediction at the level of pixels. And so the type of architecture kind of looks like this. It has 3 components. It has a visual encoder, a dynamics predictor that predicts the future state of the scene that then gets re-rendered out at the level of pixels via this frame decoder. And the loss function itself is to predict the next frame at the level of pixels. So this is self-supervised. And it's convenient because, and very common right now in robotics and machine learning, because it can be readily applied to large-scale real-world video data sets. And the thing I just want to kind of leave a mental note is that this predicts the future at the resolution of the original sensory input. So it focuses on very fine-grained details. And this is, we're going to come back to this, but this is just something to keep in mind. The other class involves having the visual encoder learn in a self-supervised way object slots, so and then generate dynamics with a graph neural network. So it tries to at least instantiate the notion of predicting at the level of object representations and their relations. And some of this is inspired by decades of developmental psychology research that shows that children at least are capable of this. And will involve the visual encoder having these fixed object slots, and then the dynamics predictor predicting the future with the relationships between these object slots learned. But the last kind of class that I want to really focus on, and it will be kind of, I guess, the most relevant, will be this latent future prediction paradigm. And the basic idea is maybe we can factorize this problem of future prediction into 2 stages. Well, one is, let's not posit an necessarily explicit object slot structure or predict at the level of pixels, but first learn a partial implicit representation of the physical world by performing a challenging vision task. And I'm going to use this word a foundation model, and it's been used, I guess, in the past to, especially in large language models, to emphasis on a reusable representation. And what I mean by reusability is that basically when we train this model, this foundation model, which is in the center here, we can deploy that representation of the scene on a variety of downstream embodied tasks in various environments. And we can use ImageNet as our baseline and other image data sets, which we will use. But the one data set that really mattered for us was Ego4D, whereby participants from around the world wear head-mounted cameras and then go about their day performing everyday actions. And so you see a lot of material properties and diverse lighting conditions, et cetera. And we found that ultimately this was a very good pre-training data set, which I'll show in a minute. But again, this isn't enough, right? This is just one representation of the scene. It's a static representation. We also then need to leverage this reusable representation to learn dynamics that can do explicit physical simulation. And the way we do that is by having a dynamical system, typically an RNN, that rather than in this bottom corner here, predicting the future state of the environment, say at the level of pixels, predicts the future state at the level of the latent representation. So in particular, this foundation model is going to be fixed, and then we're going to train the dynamics on this fission data set. Now, despite these, and we're also going to vary the architecture and training, which I'll show you. But these are the broad hypotheses, and despite these being very different, they all output a similar kind of format, which is a set of observed and simulated states of the environment that we can then go and compare to both human behavioral data on held out scenarios in fission across hundreds of human participants, as well as macaque neurophysiological data in Pong. And so I'm going to first start by talking about the neural predictivity results. So just to kind of briefly mention what type of data this is that Rishi collected, it's from 2 male monkeys across 79 random start positions of the ball. Again, I want to emphasize we don't train on this data set. We're just going to evaluate the models on this data set. And what we're going to ask is whether the internal units of the model can match the close to 1900 DMFC neurons that Rishi recorded. And in particular, we're going to match the neural dynamics, or try to match the neural dynamics when the ball is occluded from view, when the primate actually is doing this mental simulation. And so the way we do this, I guess, kind of briefly is, first we ask, since we have 2 monkeys, can we learn a transform between these 2 monkeys such that the neural dynamics are similar to one another? And then we're going to ask, take our in silico DMFC and drop it in as a replacement and ask, can it, under the same transform, match DMFC dynamics in the 2 monkeys up to how similar 2 animals are to one another? And so when we do that, when we look at neural predictivity across a range of these models, which I'll break down, the first thing is that the animals themselves seem to be quite consistent with one another. Their DMFC neural dynamics are quite consistent. So far, what we're seeing is that actually most models really fail to match the data, and then one class of models sort of is standing out as the most promising, but still there's room. And these are the video foundation models. So these are the models that have that fixed component trained on Ego 4D and then predict the future in that latent representation. And in particular, what we see is that performing this task of latent future prediction improves neural predictivity for these models across just the fixed visual encoder latent alone. And furthermore, I should mention these video foundation models were originally trained on Ego 4D in a self-supervised way, in this sort of similar to the contrastive methods that I mentioned earlier. And what we did is then we trained the dynamics across different dynamics architectures, LSTM, continuous time RNNs, and also different pre-training data. So fission are the solid bars, the hashed bars are a kinetic 700. So the architecture and training data there for the RNN didn't matter, but just basically training it on this task of future prediction improved over the latent alone with a self-supervised video foundation model. However, another way which has been popular in robotics to get these representations on Ego 4D has been to basically train on a more goal condition loss, so be more biased towards when there are actions. And so this is kind of like an offline RL objective. And what we see is that it greatly hurts neural predictivity to about 25% at best neural predictivity over a self-supervised video foundation model. So we see a differentiation. So not all video foundation models are equal. We see some differentiation at the level of loss function, fixing the data stream. Moreover, none of the end-to-end models, either pixel-wise, even though they're quite large scale, or the object slot models did well. And similarly, having our visual encoders be image foundation models, so either trained on ImageNet, either CNNs, so ResNet 50, or transformers, or on even larger web scale data sets than ImageNet, about 400 times larger, also fail to match the neurons well. And in particular, the trend that's common across these models is that they tend to be their visual representations at least tend to be most useful for image segmentation, classification, kind of more classic computer vision tasks, whereas the ones on the right appear to be most useful for robotic manipulation tasks. And so basically, for folks where these numbers are kind of 25% versus 50% don't really mean much, I guess just to make a slight analogy is that, we're kind of in a situation where we're on the upper part of the brain score curve where we were in IT with these models, where most of the earlier models are sort of failing, and there's one model class that's at least standing out amongst them, but it's still not perfectly matching the data. So there's still room to improve. And in particular, it's fine and good to match neurons, but we also wanted to ask whether or not matching neurons, which are these kind of complex objects, meters out into doing the actual task. So in particular, we ask how well can we decode the ball position while it's occluded from view, the ground truth ball position from DMFC dynamics, and then ask the same thing off of our stand-in in silico models. And what we see is that the DMFC neural predictivity is about 0.9, and the best video foundation models are approaching that ball position and velocity predictivity. And in fact, across all models, what we see is that there is some correspondence to predicting the neurons on the x-axis versus predicting the ball position and velocity, with the best, again, the two video foundation models I showed you, being able to match best overall. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, and this is kind of the last result I'll show, is that we're not just interested in Pong itself. We want to be able to have models that can be evaluated in a variety of conditions, just like you and I don't forget the physics of a new room when we enter it. And so in particular, work with Josh Tenenbaum, Dan Yammons, and Dan Baer and Judy Fan evaluated a lot of human subjects on this task of whether this red agent object will contact this patient object. So the video kind of looks like this, where, for example, you have a red domino, and then the human has to give a yes/no judgment whether there'll be contact or not before seeing the actual scenario. And so in particular, when we look at neural predictivity on the y-axis in Pong versus correlation to human response patterns on the x-axis in held-out fission scenarios, so far, the best model overall, though it's not perfect in either of these, at least just as a trend, appears to be this future prediction in the latent space of this self-supervised video foundation model. So in particular, going back to our original question, what might be the neural mechanisms that enable us to predict the future state of our environment across diverse settings? So far, at least what we're seeing is, and we're still far from a final model in this domain in particular, unlike in mouse, that one, mental simulation appears to be relevant to predicting the future state of the environment in a suitable but highly constrained latent space. And in particular, what I mean by highly constrained is that this latent space itself, or this latent representation of visual scenes, doesn't appear to just consist of fixed bespoke object plots or prioritized fine-grained details, like say at the resolution of the pixels, but mainly has to be reusable across dynamic and not static scenes. And so far what we're seeing is a correspondence between being able to be useful for downstream embodied AI tasks and being able to predict neurons well compared to, say, just kind of more classic static image segmentation classification tasks on ImageNet. But like I said, we're still far from perfect on either of these metrics. So how do we get to better models? So we see some suggestions of this in our data. One is if on this, we can kind of break it down into a sensory and a cognitive component. So on the sensory side, it might be to better leverage temporal relationships to learn a more factorized and reusable representation. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the ground truth oracles, so these are time-varying oracles of the ground truth position and velocity of the ball while it's hidden. So it's perfect access to the simulator state. They still do better than our best models that operate on pixels alone. And in particular, having access to both the ball position and velocity, at least in this Pong environment, suggests that maybe having a representation that might more explicitly represent those kind of state variables from pixels could be useful. But we don't want to sacrifice reusability, which was an important component. So for example, like simply going towards object-centric architectures that aren't learning these reusable representations hurts you in terms of matching neurons overall. So this suggests perhaps working towards object-centric still, but geared towards being video foundation model architectures. And so having more, rather than maybe paying attention only to statistics of the scene to leverage temporal relationships, but also being able to learn more concrete cognitive concepts like object properties. At the level of the dynamics portion of the model, perhaps having some type of hierarchy or modularization of timescales could be useful. There was some evidence early on from Mehrdad's group of having multiple timescales of hierarchy in frontal cortex. The reason why I suggest this is that when we look at match to human behavior and break it down by scenario and vision, what we see is that the models in terms of the best models in terms of across all of them, in terms of matching human response patterns well, struggle the most in the drape condition. So in particular, soft body interactions could be improved. But the thing is, in their training data in Ego 4D, there's lots of different soft and malleable objects, and the loss functions at the moment aren't really picking up on this or leveraging this as well. So perhaps having multiple timescales of hierarchy where you learn more, say you learn more dynamic object slots that don't vary as quickly or vary more quickly, but then material properties might not change as quickly as a second timescale hierarchy in the dynamics might be useful. It's just a suggestion. But basically, we do want to better leverage temporal relationships to learn more object properties and materials therein. So those are some of the future directions in this work. I guess I'll just end, and I'm on like in the last 2 minutes on some heuristics or some meta level principles, or not really principles, just lessons, I guess, of like across just doing this work and asking kind of questions about constraints on neural circuits in particular. So I'll kind of break this down into incorporating neuroscience insights and incorporating AI insights. And I'm going to be purposefully informal a bit just to incite a little bit of discussion. So from the standpoint of like, how do we incorporate neuroscience insights to build a better model? Very, very roughly speaking, we can incorporate 2 types of data. One is from the connectome, if we have it, or just macroscale observations of anatomy, and the other is from ethology or animal behavior. And sort of the first lesson, I guess, or bitter lesson, I guess, that was pertinent to me, at least, was typically speaking, just because you have some connectomic data, there really isn't usually a one-to-one mapping from the connectome to a functional model. And in fact, it's actually very easy to get these details wrong when you're trying to fill in what you don't know with what you think you know. And so as just like a caution that I've seen, the best model often requires a type of balance between functional optimization for a goal with more macro scale structural constraints, e.g. shallow versus deep, for example, like we saw in mouse visual cortex. From the standpoint of incorporating notions from ethology, like where you get these goals from, it's not obvious that ethology alone gives us always the correct functional optimization target, especially for, say, like intermediate brain areas, so that are far from action. So in particular, like the examples being, for example, whisking as a loss didn't give rise to well-matched visual representations in mouse visual cortex. Similarly, RL-based objectives, which are so far have been state-of-the-art for RL tasks, end-to-end training of a visual system with an RL objective hasn't been yielding both in mouse and in primates, at least so far, a very good neurally aligned visual representation. Rather, what has been helpful has been more kind of domain general self-supervised objectives. And in some sense, perhaps it highlights a broader theme that it's sometimes useful to consider the brain area, say, e.g. the sensory system is embodied in a larger cognitive agent. So it's going to have to learn a domain general representation to be then useful for a bunch of different downstream brain areas, not just action alone, for example, or just whisking. On the other side is kind of incorporating AI insights, and I sort of mentioned this, is it's tempting, I think, in the realm of, say, like, successes that we've seen with end-to-end reinforcement learning. But in terms of if we're concerned about building neurally predictive models, doesn't seem to be giving us neurally aligned, at least visual systems in both these species. And perhaps it might point to a possible functional modularization of optimization targets across brain areas, whereby reusable for downstream tasks, self-supervised representations, so far best matching visual areas overall, but maybe say for motor areas, having this reinforcement learning based objective that's more biased towards action could be useful. So it's not obvious to me at this stage that an end-to-end kind of monolithic loss would give rise to kind of, good predictions of neural responses across brain areas and across species. And again, these aren't like theorems or principles, but they're just trends that at least, I've seen across these data sets and thought it might be useful to highlight and discuss further, but we can of course talk about anything. But I'll just end on time around 5, since I know a lot of people have to leave, by thanking my collaborators, Nathan, Changshu, Justin, Anthony, and Dan, and Rishi, Murdad, and Robert on the mental simulation work, as well as my funding sources, the Icon Center, and thank you so much for your time.